Hi everyone, today we will be discussing the connection between patent foramen ovale and migraine. This topic represents an important intersection between cardiology and neurology that may have implications for treatment approaches. We will go through the anatomical and physiological basis of this condition, then the evidence for its connection to migraine, and the current state of clinical research on potential treatment options. This video is brought to you in partnership with Neura Health. More information about that in the description below. Let's start by understanding how the foramen ovale develops and functions. In a developing fetus, the lungs are not functional. Instead, the baby receives oxygenated blood from the placenta. Obviously, this is via the mother. So oxygen-rich blood travels along the umbilical vein, through the ductus venosus, and up into the inferior vena cava. Because it goes through the ductus venosus, it also bypasses the liver. Once it reaches the inferior vena cava, it enters the right atrium of the heart. Just quickly, let's just draw a heart here. This would be the right atrium. This would be the left atrium. This would be the right ventricle. This would be the left ventricle. So we have oxygenated blood that enters the right atrium. Now, because the blood is oxygenated, there's no need for it to enter the lungs. However, because there's an increase in pulmonary pressure, pulmonary vascular resistance, the blood does not go into the lungs. The lungs are filled with fluid. So what the foramen ovale does, it allows this hole for the blood to go directly from the right atrium to the left atrium. So instead of going to the right atrium, then the right ventricle, then through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, it goes directly from the right atrium to the left atrium. So this very important foramen ovale permits us to bypass the non-functional lungs and flow directly into the left atrium. And then from there, the blood enters the left ventricle, how it normally does, and then flows out from the aorta to the rest of the body, to systemic circulation, delivering the much needed oxygen. Now, what we call this is a right to left shunt. So a foramen ovale is a needed right to left shunt because it shunts blood from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart. Now, let me erase this mess. Now, this shunt, the foramen ovale, is incredibly essential for life. For fetal life, foramen ovale is needed, or else there's no way to get oxygenated blood into systemic circulation. There's no way it's going to reach the organs that very much need oxygen, including the brain. Now, at birth, when a baby takes his first breath, the lungs begin to function, and the pulmonary pressure, which was high, now drops. So we have a decrease of pulmonary vascular resistance. So as the baby breathes, oxygenated blood returns from the now functioning lungs into the left atrium. And at the same time, blood flow from the placenta stops. And of course, with the help of clamping from the OBGYN as well. Now, what ends up happening is that the right atrium experiences a reduction in pressure. We don't have this copious amount of blood coming from the placenta anymore. So therefore, we have less pressure in the right atrium. So now, because we have high pressure, an increase of pressure in the left atrium, and a decrease of pressure in the right atrium, the flaps, now you can't really appreciate the flaps in the picture here, so let me just draw here. So we have the left atrium and the right atrium, and then we have the interventricular septum, let's draw it here. So there's a flap here and a flap here, and then blood flow goes through this foramen ovale. Now, when we increase pressure in the left atrium and decrease pressure of the right atrium, which I told you is what happens here, these flaps close. So we have a closure of the flaps. So the flaps that form the foramen ovale end up pressing together, closing the foramen ovale. This closure typically happens immediately after birth, with complete anatomical closure or fusion of these flaps happening within months. Well, that's what's supposed to happen. However, in some individuals, the foramen ovale doesn't completely close. This condition is known as a patent foramen ovale, or a PFO. It remains open in approximately 25% of the general population. In most cases, a PFO doesn't cause noticeable problems because the pressure in the left atrium is typically higher than the pressure in the right atrium. So essentially, even if it doesn't fuse, it should remain closed. Higher pressure here, lower pressure here. So therefore, this should prevent any significant blood flow moving from right to left, from venous circulation going into systemic circulation. That's what we want to prevent, right? We want to prevent this deoxygenated venous blood entering the heavily rich oxygenated systemic blood, arterial blood. And if a hole remains here, that means there's a direct line for deoxygenated blood to enter the left atrium, resulting in a mix between deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. Because as you recall, you get deoxygenated blood from your veins, it enters the heart, goes into the right atrium, goes into the right ventricle, enters the pulmonary artery, goes into the lungs, gets oxygenated in the lungs, comes back through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, then the left ventricle, then into systemic circulation. So let me erase this so it looks clear. So what ends up happening with this hole here is that we're getting deoxygenated blood going and mixing with the oxygenated blood, making the oxygen levels decrease. But that's not the only issue. It's not just about deoxygenated blood, and we'll get to how this matters in terms of migraine in a bit. Now, as I said before, most people are usually asymptomatic. They don't even know they have a pained foramen ovale. People can live their entire lives without knowing they have a hole in their heart, that the flaps have not fused. Why? Because they generally remain closed. Again, with high pressure here and low pressure here, the flaps close naturally. Even if they're not anatomically closed, they're functionally closed. However, under certain conditions, that temporary right atrial pressure, such as during coughing or straining, aka the Valsalva maneuver, it becomes possible for blood to flow from the right atrium to the left atrium. So anything that increases right atrial pressure will force these flaps open and allow blood flow to go from the right atrium to the left atrium. So it transiently remains open when a person with PFO coughs, or they strain, which can happen when lifting a heavy object, lifting weights, and so on and so forth. Why does it matter? Why would a patent foramen ovale matter? Well, it matters in the context of clots. If there is a blood clot in the vein, usually a deep vein thrombosis or a DVT, is in the leg, it gets dislodged, it'll eventually make its way into the right atrium. So let's say this is a clot, makes its way to the right atrium. Generally, it'll go to the right ventricle, into the pulmonary artery, and either get dissolved in the lungs, or it'll cause a pulmonary embolism or a PE. Now, PEs can be bad. Pulmonary embolisms can be bad. They can be fatal. However, they're not as bad as getting that same clot into the arterial system. Now, if a PFO is present, that same clot will go into the right atrium and can find its way into the left atrium. Now it went from venous circulation to arterial circulation. Because it's now in systemic circulation, it can enter the brain, or it can cause another systemic embolic event. This is referred to as a paradoxical embolism, because if the clot goes into the right atrium and there's a transient increase in pressure due to coughing, straining, whatever, can make its way into systemic circulation and enter the brain and systemic circulation. Again, this is paradoxical embolism. Now, the connection between PFO and migraine was actually discovered by accident through observations of deep sea divers. Divers with decompression sickness were found to have a higher rate of patent foramen ovale. So this happens because nitrogen bubbles can pass directly from venous to arterial circulation through the PFO as the divers make their ascent out of the water. Now, when these divers got their PFOs surgically closed, as you can see here, in order to prevent decompression sickness, many found that their migraine improved or even disappeared completely after the procedure. So this resulted in researchers looking more closely at the possible connection between PFO and migraine. So when we examine the prevalence data, we see a correlation between PFO and migraine. Studies show that 46 to 88% of migraine with aura patients have a PFO. This is compared to only about 25% in the general population. For migraine without aura, the prevalence is about 16 to 35%, which is more similar to the general population. Also, about 66% of chronic migraine patients have a PFO. Now, these numbers suggest that there is a potential link between the two conditions. Although we must remember that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. However, the higher prevalence in migraine with aura patients is notable and has led researchers to investigate whether there might be a causal relationship between PFO and migraine. Now, there are several hypotheses attempting to explain the potential mechanisms by which PFO could lead to migraine attacks. The first is the chemical bypass theory. Normally, the lungs will filter out certain chemicals from the blood. However, in patients with PFO, some blood can bypass the lungs. We can avoid going into the pulmonary artery, right? So blood goes from the right atrium to the right ventricle, into the pulmonary artery, into the lungs, gets oxygenated, and goes back through the pulmonary veins here into the left atrium. Now, certain chemicals in our venous system can avoid the lungs entirely, so the lungs will not be able to process certain chemicals in patients with PFO. So if we have blood that bypasses the lungs and goes directly into the left atrium, substances like serotonin, for example, can reach the brain in higher concentrations. And these substances can then trigger migraine attacks in susceptible individuals just by not entering the lungs, by avoiding the lungs. There are an increase of certain substances that can go into the brain and trigger a migraine attack. A second theory involves microemboli and cortical spreading depression. Now let's erase some of this here. Now this is a complex process where tiny blood clots can then pass through the patent foramen ovale. So they go from the venous to the arterial system. Now, again, these aren't emboli, but microemboli. And these microemboli can cause small areas of reduced blood flow in the brain, because eventually we want arterial blood to enter the brain. And so we have these microemboli going into systemic circulation, going to the brain, and possibly resulting in localized tissue hypoxia, decreased O2 in very, very small areas of the brain. Low oxygen in certain areas of the brain, not enough to cause a stroke, not enough to result in an ischemic stroke, but enough to trigger something we call cortical spreading depression. And I have a video on that if you'd like to understand what that is. And then cortical spreading depression, which is basically just a wave of neuronal glial depolarization, is believed to be the underlying mechanism for migraine with aura. So it makes sense because PFO is seen more, there's a higher prevalence in people with migraine with aura. And this phenomenon can then activate the trigeminal vascular system, resulting in migraine pain as well. Now, a third theory is chronic hypoxemia. A PFO can cause a general decrease in blood oxygen level because we are mixing deoxygenated right atrial blood with oxygenated blood. Deoxygenated blood from venous circulation with oxygenated blood that will go into arterial circulation. This decrease in oxygen may possibly make the brain more susceptible to migraine attacks or migraine triggers. Finally, there may be shared genetic factors contributing to both PFO and migraine susceptibility. So that would explain the co-occurrence without necessarily implying a direct causal relationship. Given the potential link, a meta-analysis was done to evaluate the effect of PFO closure on patients with migraine refractory to multiple medications. The results showed that the PFO closure group had a greater reduction in migraine frequency. They had less monthly migraine attacks. They had a higher rates of complete migraine resolution, and they had a significant reduction in monthly migraine days compared to the control group. Now, when looking at subgroups, the results became even more interesting. Patients with migraine with aura, particularly those with frequent migraine, had a significantly greater reduction in migraine days and a higher incidence of complete migraine cessation following PFO closure. In contrast, patients with migraine without aura did not see a significant benefit. There were no significant reduction in migraine days or improvement in complete headache cessation after PFO closure. So this suggests that the relationship between PFO and migraine may be strongest in those with aura symptoms. So while PFO closure appears to be generally a safe procedure, it's important to note that some adverse events have been reported in clinical trials. So these include transient atrial fibrillation, general fatigue, syncope, procedure-related events such as access site bleeding, retroperitoneal hematoma, and other events like anemia and nosebleeds, things of that nature. However, most adverse events resolved without any long-term consequences, and there were no significant device-related side effects that were observed after at least 1 year of follow-up in these studies. Now, despite the promising results in some groups, PFO closure is not currently recommended for migraine patients. It may be considered for specific subgroups of patients. However, a personalized approach is essential, and patients should consult with healthcare professionals for individual advice and treatment options. The connection between PFO, migraine, and stroke adds another layer of complexity to this relationship. Migraine patients, especially those with aura, have an increased risk of stroke. There's also high prevalence of PFO in patients with unexplained or cryptogenic strokes. Nearly 80% of cryptogenic stroke patients with migraine had a PFO. The relationship between these three conditions, PFO, migraine, and stroke, particularly migraine with aura, let me actually just write that here because it's very important, appears to be related in complex ways that we're still working to understand fully. And the complex relationship has important clinical implications. For instance, patients with migraine with aura and PFO might be at an exceptionally elevated risk of stroke, which could influence treatment decisions. However, more research is still needed to clarify these relationships and determine optimal treatment strategies. Now, the key takeaways. The relationship between painted foramen ovale and migraine is an evolving research area and has many unanswered questions. While there appears to be a strong association between PFO and migraine with aura, the exact mechanisms underlying this relationship are still being investigated. Also, PFO closure may benefit select patients, like those with frequent aura who haven't responded well to standard migraine treatments. However, this intervention isn't appropriate for all migraine patients, and careful patient selection is crucial. Again, future research is needed. We need more research. Lastly, a personalized approach is essential. There has to be a consideration of each patient's specific symptoms, medical history, and risk factors when making treatment decisions. Collaboration between neurologists and cardiologists is vital in managing these patients effectively. Now, these are the references. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below.